I'm Courtney Tita, and I'm with Wild Farm Alliance. Thanks for joining us today. This is our 10th and final lesson of the Role of Birds on Midwest Farms webinar series. I want to just have everybody watch, keep your eyes out for a announcement about an upcoming field day that we're going to have in July, where we're going to highlight a bunch of these conservation practices that benefit birds and wildlife that we've been talking about through this whole series. We have a 2050 vision in our three program areas are that we aim to see 1 million nest boxes and perches on farms in our farmland flyways program. We want to see hedgerows of habitat the length of to the moon and back, which is about 500,000 miles in our farmland wildways program. And then 10% of the river frontage of farms planted as farmland waterways, leading to 100,000 miles of ravine habitat. We are super excited to let you know about the beta version of our Explorer tool. This is a super cool tool where you can input a pest that you are concerned about, and then we will tell you what birds eat that pest and then what plants provide the habitat needed to attract those birds to your farm. So please check that out, play around with it. It's just the beginning. We're super excited as we develop these online tools that can help people create habitat on their farms for birds and pollinators and all kinds of good wildlife. We also have a new publication that's available on our website that relates to today's webinar, Protecting Birds in Agricultural Landscapes. This publication highlights the ways farmers can reduce risks to birds while maintaining productive working lands. You'll find research on which pesticides, both conventional and organic, are most harmful to birds, best practices for terminating cover crops to protect ground nesting birds, and guidance on safe nest box placement near roads and high traffic areas. Today's webinar on birds at risks, how pesticides shape safety on agricultural lands is going to be with Hardy Klein, the Director of Government Relations for the American Bird Conservancy's Pesticides and Birds campaign, and Madhu Khanna, the ACE's Distinguished Professor of Environmental Economics in the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Economics. She's also the Alvin H. Baum Family Chair and Director of the Institute of Sustainability, Energy, and Environment, all at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. We are also offering 1 credit of continuing education credit from the American Society of Agronomy. To receive credit, please have your license number handy and enter it into the evaluation form that we'll be sharing at the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the chat. If you have any issues, let us know. And we're going to start today's lesson with Hardy. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Courtney, and hello, everyone. I am so honored to be here today and to be part of this series. It's been an absolutely fantastic set of webinars so far, and I don't know if we've saved the best for last, but we're going to number 10, and I'm really excited. So yeah, I'm Hardy Kern. I'm Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy's Pesticides and Birds campaign. And I have a really interesting role that I absolutely adore because American Bird Conservancy is one of the few conservation groups in the United States that has a position entirely dedicated to the impact of pesticides on birds and finding regulatory and legislative solutions for it, but also doing a lot of education and outreach around how birds are impacted by pesticides. And I also have to say it is beyond an honor to be part of this today with Wild Farm Alliance and to be presenting with Dr. Khanna because I'm a huge fan of all of her work. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the way that pesticides are registered in the United States and how pesticides impact birds, a few different classes of them that are commonly used in agriculture. And we wanted to touch on this today because there is a lot of agriculture that happens in the United States, a lot of different types of it. And when you read news headlines, when we read new scientific reports, there seems to be lots and lots of information constantly coming out about the negative impacts of especially synthetic chemical pesticides on wildlife and ecosystems. And it can seem a little bit like, well, why are we having to wait until these things are deployed in the field? Why aren't we catching these earlier on? Why is it that we're hearing about all of these negative impacts now as opposed to earlier on? And so I wanted to kind of give a very, very wide angle focus on how pesticides are approved in the US and especially how they interact with bird populations. So, in the United States, we have a law called FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, that was first passed in 1947. And FIFRA is the law that outlines how pesticides have to be registered and approved and mitigated in the United States. When it was first signed into law, the Environmental Protection Agency did not exist. The entirety of pesticide approval and registration was handled by the United States Department of Agriculture because growers and producers are primarily the ones who are using these products. Then in the 70s, when the EPA was created, following all the fabulous work done by Rachel Carson and other environmental scientists studying the impacts of DDT on birds and other wildlife and even human health, they saw the need to fill in this gap of trying to protect the environment from things that humans were doing throughout the country. And so authority over pesticides was transferred from the USDA to the Environmental Protection Agency. The biggest relic, though, from the former USDA days is that the people who were really relying on the products and really needed a lot of pesticides to be approved, so very conventional farmers usually, were the ones who were essentially in charge of figuring out how pesticides are impacting the environment. A lot of that carried over to the EPA, and it's taken a long time for those regulations to be updated, but we still see relics of it today. And the biggest thing that I want you to remember about FIFRA is that it is not a law that is designed to protect nature as its first line of consideration. It is essentially a cost benefit analysis law. When we think about the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act, those are laws that have ecosystem and wildlife protection as their number one goal. FIFRA is a law that sets out to consider how a product works, what negative impacts it might have, but also what positive impacts it might have, and then try to find a registration somewhere in between it. So when the EPA is registering a pesticide, there's a long process that goes through, and it starts with a pesticide company, also known as a registrant, submitting a petition for a new chemical to the EPA, a new active ingredient. And an active ingredient is the part of a pesticide that does the killing, the repelling, the prevention, or the destroying of a particular pest. The EPA then asks the company for all the testing data that they've done. They can ask them for specific information. They can say, we'd like you to redo these tests or we'd like to see more. But the important thing to know here is that almost all of the information is coming from the companies themselves. The companies also pay a registration fee as part of this application process, which funds the EPA to investigate all of their work. If it is a new chemical, something that's never existed before, they really are only reliant on the company that has created it. If it's an existing chemical that's being used in a new way, you might get lucky and there might be some existing field trial data or some other scientific studies that have gone on, but that is rarely the case. When the EPA is looking at these chemicals, they are looking at the active ingredients, the inert ingredients, which are the other parts of a pesticide that aren't the thing doing the killing, repelling, prevention, or destruction. And those are usually industry secrets. So if you look at a pesticide label, it'll list the active ingredient and how much of that overall volume is the active ingredient. And then it'll typically say something like inerts or other additives. Those are not usually listed because those are considered to be industry or trade secrets. It's part of intellectual property, and therefore the companies protect their own financial interest and do not disclose it. The EPA also considers the method of action, so how a particular chemical works, And then they are supposed to consider potential environmental and human health impacts by running the pesticides through a bunch of different tests. However, on the right-hand side here, the things which are not consistently, oops, went ahead of myself, which are not consistently part of testing are looking at potential synergistic impacts. So what happens when a particular chemical interacts with another chemical in the environment? Is that a different impact? Cumulative impacts. So if we're using the same active ingredient in several formulations all on the same crop, what happens when it's all taken together? The efficacy of a product. So this isn't usually the case. Usually the pesticides are evaluated for efficacy, but technically, federal statute does not say that companies have to prove that their products work as intended. They just have to look at the health risks of them. And then, of course, real world impacts, because almost all of these chemicals are being tested in very, very strict laboratory settings. And when we talk about how these products are impacted or are evaluated for their impacts on wildlife, there are a few different species that usually serve as the surrogates. So, to determine how a particular pesticide will impact all birds, all reptiles, and all amphibians, the two birds which are most commonly used in lab tests are quails and mallard ducks. So these are laboratory settings, and then those results are extrapolated for impacts on all species of birds. So everything from things as small as a little songbird or a hummingbird up to cranes and storks. Then they are also extrapolated to see how they might impact reptiles. So everything from snakes and turtles to lizards, as well as amphibians. And then for terrestrial and aquatic invertebrates, the two surrogate species used are European honeybees, which behave very differently from a lot of native bees, and a small aquatic invertebrate called Daphnia magna. These are convenient, they're easily bred in laboratory settings. They have a lot of their own limitations. The most important one to remember, though, for especially Daphnia, is that there's been studies that show that they tend to be particularly resistant to certain insecticides. So they're not the best surrogate species. And then for all mammals and for all human impacts, usually it's lab rats that are used. We did a report here at American Bird Conservancy with Dr. Pierre Minot, who's a renowned ecotoxicologist, and he looked at some of the testing data submitted to the EPA for a few different insecticides, particularly neonicotinoid insecticides, which we're going to hear a lot more about later. And what he found when he started digging into the toxicity data, known as the LD50 or the lethal dose at 50, he found that if you plot the size of a bird against the amount of chemical that's needed to be lethal to them, it goes up based on body size, which is pretty much what you would expect. So this top graph shows that with relatively small birds that eat in a certain way, as you expose them to more and more of a chemical, or as they get heavier and heavier with species, they need to be exposed to more and more of a chemical. But I'll also remind you that birds eat a lot of different things and act in a lot of different ways. So this isn't always the most straightforward thing. The bottom graph here is showing a logarithmic evaluation of that same data. And the biggest thing to take away here is the smaller a bird's body size is and the faster their metabolism, the less chemical it takes to actually impact them and show sublethal impacts. So this direct laboratory toxicity data that we're getting is not necessarily commensurate with what is actually happening to birds in the real world. So from insecticides, we see a lot of different impacts on birds, everything from habitat loss because the detritivores and the pollinating insects might be impacted from overuse of insecticides, which leads to less habitat. Birds can be exposed to certain insecticides and they can be lethal when they are ingested. Prey loss is a major driver. Fewer beneficial insects means there's less for birds to eat, and that's going to lead to generational impacts. You can get sublethal impacts. So maybe they weren't exposed to enough insecticide to be toxically lethal, but they can cause all sorts of different impacts from weight loss to the inability to migrate to, even decrease spermatogenesis, decreased egg production. And then we don't really know what happens with chronic exposure. So when birds are exposed to a small amount over a very long period of time, it's really, really hard to know what those impacts actually are. With herbicides, there's a lot of different methods of action that are imposed or that are used out in the field. Some things that we see a lot are the over-the-top spray herbicides like dicamba and 2,4-D can degrade habitat that birds rely on. So species, especially like oaks, are particularly susceptible. They are also major hosts for different Lepidoptera, so moths and butterflies, the caterpillars of which are really important food sources for birds. So herbicides are having this impact. And then there's also a lot of different studies which have been done, which show that herbicide drift and herbicide overuse can reduce early season weeds that pop up, which produce seeds, which birds rely on before the insects emerge. They show that when there are fewer non-crop plants. There were fewer insects in a particular environment, and they've even extrapolated it out to find that when there's fewer native plants, it leads to fewer native insects, which leads to fewer native birds. And then perhaps the most direct impacts that we see from some chemicals are the rodenticides, the chemicals that are designed to kill mice and rats and other vermin that can be agricultural problems. Two basic categories, anticoagulants that work by thinning a rodent's blood essentially, and then causing organ failure. And then there's a few other methods of action. You have first and second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. The second generations, or SGARs, are highly toxic in very small amounts. And then in the other methods of action, we have neurotoxins, stomach gas poisonings, and ones that cause calcium buildup. The anticoagulants tend to be worse for birds overall because if a bird ingests any of a mouse or a rat or a squirrel, or in the case of some insectivores, even an ant that has wandered into a baited trap and is carrying the food out, when they ingest that poisoned organism, they will experience the same impacts themselves. And there are a lot of different ways that we can reduce all of these impacts to birds. That resource, which was mentioned earlier, walks you beautifully through lots of different types of product, how they might impact birds and other wildlife, and even what some good alternatives are going to be. But the fundamental thing that I want you to take away from this talk is that we are seeing a lot of real world impacts on birds because when the EPA is doing its registration of chemicals and its analysis, the models that we have, the testing data that we rely on, and sometimes the information that we're getting from the people creating these products is not designed to be protective of wild birds. It is designed to make sure that chemicals are hitting their targets and that we have a few mitigations we can put in place. But usually, until these chemicals are used widely out in the real world, we don't know what their impacts might be. So any chance we get to use less of them, to use a safer alternative, to become more regenerative is a way that we can help more wild birds. So every action and every acre that you can affect makes a huge difference for birds. And I don't know if I've left enough time for any questions right now. I packed a lot in there, so I will stop sharing my screen and turn it back over to you, Courtney.
Awesome. Thanks so much. That was great. We are gonna post the poll questions. And if anybody has a question, please enter it into the chat. Are there birds that would be better for them to look at besides the mallards and quail?
It's a really good question. I don't want this to come across as necessarily advocating for, more or less types of animal testing, but there are some labs which occasionally will use zebra finches as a model organism. And because those are smaller bodied, they tend to eat seeds more. They have a metabolism that's much more similar to native songbirds. Those can provide a much more accurate representation. There's also been some really good work that's done with wild caught birds that are then brought into a lab setting. Particularly, this has been done with red-winged blackbirds and with white-crowned sparrows. And I think that those are really good models because those are birds living in wild conditions that are actually going to be exposed to some of these different products. Um, it's also tough because the way that they have to do some of these studies, there's a particular chemical that was developed to try to reduce algal blooms. And when they were doing the laboratory studies, it was so toxic and so bad tasting to ducks that they couldn't even get a full test done on mallards because every time they tried to feed it to them, they kept regurgitating. So they switched to using only quails as the model organism for this particular chemical. And what's interesting about that is the chemical was designed to be used in ponds and streams and lakes, where the things that are most likely going to be exposed to it, bird-wise, are ducks. So they couldn't even get a good duck model in a lab and had to turn to quail. And yet that's what still led to the product's registration. So I think we need to see a much wider and more representative laboratory animal setting. So the smaller songbirds might be more helpful, but also doing more wide scale field trials before a chemical is fully brought to market and made available for purchase would be really helpful. Because again, in these lab settings, we're not seeing cumulative impacts, synergistic impacts, what happens over a long series of years. I mean, a chronic exposure test can be as few as 20 days as opposed to several months, which is more likely the exposure period out in the wild.
I'm going to have you go over the poll questions.
Absolutely. So, question one, which species are most commonly used as surrogates? Mallard and quail are the most common, but everything on that list except for great blue herons can sometimes be used as a test species for these chemicals. And then question two, just about everybody got it. So everything can be impacted by pesticides in one way or another. Prey availability, rodent prey availability, native seed availability, habitat availability and quality, all are impacted by the chemicals commonly used in agriculture. So yeah, we got almost 100% on both. Great job, y'all.
Awesome. Great. Well, let's hand it over to Dr. Khanna, and then we can go from there.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today and to talk about some of the research that I and some other colleagues have been doing on trying to quantify the effects of neonicotinoids and other pesticides on birds and butterflies. And I think this really, Hardy set it up really well. And this research is looking at the real world impact of these pesticides on non-target organisms like birds and butterflies. And in that, it's complicated to do that because you have to control for many other factors that can also impact them, and have a lot of data to do so. But this is some work that we had done a few years ago, and so I'm happy to share that with you. Just as sort of a background, over the last 2, 3 decades or more, actually, there's been an evolution in the type of pest control technology that we've been using for corn and soybean, and largely grown in the Midwest. Prior to the mid 1990s, there was the farmers were using non-glyphosate and other chemicals, which are called pyrethroids and organophosphates for weed control and insect control. After the mid 1990s, early 2000s, there's been greater use of GM based seeds, and which express a protein that can repel various types of insects that could attack the corn and soybeans. And so that led to, in the case of for weed control, led to much greater use of glyphosate. And it also, after over that period, there's also been greater use of neonicotinoid treated crop seeds because over time, farmers are finding that even with the Bt traits, there was growing resistance, and so they needed something stronger to combat the weeds and the pests. And these different types of approaches differ in terms of their impact on the target species as well as on other species. And neonicotinoids, there's been a lot of concern that they can have a very significantly negative effect on non-target species. So, neonicotinoids is essentially a coating on the seed, like an insecticidal dust, and that is then taken up by the plant tissue as the crop develops and protect the plant. But there's, also evidence that 85% of it leaches into the environment. And while it's great because it provides this broad spectrum way to deal with insect pests, but the leached neonicotinoid can persist in the water and the soil, and then it can be consumed by other species, and it's really harmful for them. The use of this has really grown since 2004, mainly with increased appearance of new types of insects, and also as a way to supplement the Bt traded corn that was developed, that insects were developing resistance to. So, there's been a lot of lab and field studies that have shown the negative impacts of these insecticides on honeybees, wild bees, and butterflies, and can also affect birds and aquatic invertebrates and mammals. Essentially, very broad impacts because they're on the field, and they're consumed by the birds. They run off, leach into the water bodies, so they impact the organisms in the water bodies, and then the birds, it affects their reproductive system. So it's not just the birds immediate, that consume it, or the other organisms that consume it that are impacted, but then it affects future growth and reproduction. And so it has these long-term effects on bird population and diversity because there are fewer birds left to reproduce. Um, weed control is the other issue that farmers deal with, and although these may not directly impact, they're meant to impact weeds, they may not directly impact insects, but they can have an indirect effect on insects because they kill the weeds and the habitat for insects and reduce the forage resources, and so that can have a negative impact on insects. And so that's kind of the other concern, and particularly that's an issue for monarch butterflies that rely upon milkweed, and that glyphosate kind of has a negative effect on milkweed, and so therefore it can have an indirectly negative impact on monarch butterflies as well. And there's been concern that the number of monarch butterflies has declined since the increase in the glyphosate adoption took place. So overall, the graph on the bottom right shows the overall pesticide use, sort of the neonicotinoid pesticide use has remained, as you can see. I mean, it's declined since 1996. And kind of, been relatively flat in recent years. This data is actually only till 2014 because data after 2014 is not available, at least the last time I checked. And so our study was limited to the period before 2014. And the top graph shows the exponential growth that took place in neonicotinoid use since compared to the mid 1990s. And it's preferred over other approaches for various reasons. There's, many different ways in which it can be applied through spray, injections, and seed treatments, broad spectrum, toxicity, and it's really potent for insects. And so now, over the last several decades, there is growing evidence that bird biodiversity has been declining. And in the US, some studies estimate a decline by about 30% since 1970. In particular, the grassland birds have been declining faster than any other type, and estimated to have declined by 53% since 1970. And in addition to that, population of butterflies has been declining, in many countries, including the US and particularly in the Midwest. And a number of different reasons have been, put forward for that. This includes intensification of agricultural production, including increasing use of pesticides, conversion of land from, non-cropland or grassland to cropland, which then leads to more chemical applications. And then, of course, the big one is also climate change. So in the real world, trying to estimate the effects of these pesticides and sort it out and isolate that effect compared to all these other factors that can impact different species is challenging because it really requires very fine scale data on all of these factors that you have to control for in order to be able to determine the impact of one particular aspect. And so this particular study that we did was trying to analyze like how much of the reduction in four different types of bird species could be attributed to neonicotinoid use, and then also compare that to the effect of other types of pesticide. So we looked at four different types of birds: grassland birds, non-grassland birds, insectivorous birds, and non-insectivorous birds. We looked at the period 2008 to 2014 because of the availability of data. And we were using three different measures of bird biodiversity. So one was just the number of birds observed. The second was the number of bird species that were observed. And the third was something called the index of diversity, which looks at the evenness, of different species in a location. So the relative abundance of different species to see, if that diversity was increasing or decreasing. And what we find in summary is that we really found a very strong negative, and it was a statistically significant impact of on the population of each of these four types of birds. So the population of the number of birds and the abundance of birds is negatively affected for all four types. But the impact on the species richness and the evenness, was negative, but not as statistically significant. It on the insectivorous birds in particular, but it was significant for the grassland birds. And we also found that non-neonicotinoid pesticide use also had similar effects in that they were negative on all four types of birds, but the effect was substantially smaller. And so, an increase by the same amount of neonicotinoid use had an effect that was 40 times larger than that of non-neonicotinoid pesticide use. And so it just shows it was much more lethal, much more potent than other types of pesticides. But we also find other factors that affect bird biodiversity. Cropland expansion clearly has a negative effect on all four types of birds, and we also, we sort of quantified what that effect was, and the effect varies in terms of the effect on species richness and biodiversity, but in general. We found that the grassland birds in particular suffer more negatively than the insectivorous birds. In fact, in some elements of insectivorous birds were not affected that much by cropland acreage expansion. The other interesting thing was that these effects are not one time. These effects linger on for several years in the future, and that is because when we reduce bird populations in one year, it affects the population of birds that are left to reproduce, and therefore it affects future growth of birds. And I should mention that the data that we were using for measuring bird abundance is from a breeding bird survey that has been done for a long time in the US, and it looks at the birds that are there in the breeding season, which is, this is the season, sort of April to June or so. And so that's kind of the measure. And here, the graph on the in the top is looking at the change in the population for grassland and non-grassland birds. The blue being the grassland birds, and the red is the non-grassland birds. So the effect on non-grassland birds is much smaller, but on grassland birds is much larger. And this shows that in having like applying 100 kilograms more of neonicotinoids in a year, let's say you do that in 2008, it shows that the effect lasts till 2014 at a declining rate. And so that's kind of the persistence effect. The bottom figure shows the effect on insectivorous birds and non-insectivorous birds, and those effects are much smaller, particularly on the non-insectivorous birds, but a similar pattern of lingering persistent effects. And then here we were looking at, in doing any of this research, we can observe what's happening. What is the most challenging is to figure out what would have happened if we hadn't applied these neonicotinoids. So it's like, what is a counterfactual? Because we don't observe the counterfactual. And so that's where we use statistical methods and a lot of data to be able to figure out what would have happened if we had not, observed if we had not applied the neonicotinoids. And so in this particular figure for the different types of birds, you can see that the counterfactual without neonicotinoid use is a red graph, and we have both the static model and the dynamic model, but essentially the orange is looking at the counterfactual without neonicotinoids, and the purple is with neonicotinoids. And you can see particularly for the grassland birds, which is the top left, and then the insectivorous birds, the gap between those two, between the red lines and the purple line, is the largest. It's not so much for the non-grassland and the non-insectivorous birds, which really shows that, if we would have had the orange line, there would have been some decline anyway in both these types of birds for other reasons like cropland expansion, climate change, and so on. But the purple line shows what happens because of the neonicotinoid use. And then here we mapped out where the impacts have happened based on our model over the period 2008 to 2014. The red, orange, and red are where the impacts have been the largest. A lot of impacts in the Midwest, and then also neonicotinoids are also used in urban settings, and so you see some impacts in California and other urban locations. And these effects are particularly large for the grassland and insectivorous bird populations. And then I also wanted to share results from another study that was done by some colleagues at Michigan State University that looked at the effects of different types of pesticides on butterflies, and they used similar measure of species richness, total abundance, which is the middle set of diagrams, and then on the right is the monarch butterfly. So focused on different, all types of butterflies, and specifically also on monarch butterflies. And you can see from the top panel of figures A, D, and G that if you look at the neonicotinoids, you could see the most negative impact of that relative to the other types of pesticides and herbicides that have been applied. So clearly here too, these neonicotinoids have a much more lethal impact than all the other types of pesticides, and including the Bt trait seeds, which have been which have actually often been a source of concern. And there's been a lot of research about how GM is bad for monarch butterflies, but it's really, in fact, the graph at the far end G shows that the impact might even have been marginally positive, but it's really chemicals and neonicotinoids that have the biggest negative impact. The control for land use and the effects of different types of land use cover different types of weather and wet and hot and wet weather and so on, and those effects are more mixed for different types of species and so on. So, in general, what we find is that, there's a lot of evidence which shows that it's in the case of butterflies in particular, insecticides, and it's not herbicides really that have the biggest negative impact on butterflies. And the even Bt seed adoption does not have the same kind of effect as that of neonicotinoids. And so it really requires us to think about how to reduce the use of neonicotinoids. And in the case of, GM seeds could actually be mildly beneficial or relatively less harmful. And how do we continue to not develop resistance to of pests to that? Um, there was also no association between the use of glyphosate, herbicides, and monarch butterfly. Even though what's been sort of an issue of concern is that it does impact milkweed, which is a habitat for monarch butterflies. But at least during the period of this study, they didn't notice that. And that could have been because much of the negative effects on milkweed happened prior to the period of this study. And so it didn't show up here. In the case of bird biodiversity, there's clearly ecological risks associated with the use of neonicotinoids on birds, and particularly on grassland birds and insectivorous bird biodiversity. And these come directly from the birds, consuming the seeds, and also, because, and indirectly because it disrupts the food supply for the birds, because the insects are what they consume. And then by reducing the population of birds, it also hampers future reproduction capacity and therefore has long-term consequences. So I will stop with that and turn it over to Courtney.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating, such an interesting topic we have today. Let's launch the poll questions. And if anybody has a question for either of our speakers, please put them in the chat.
There's a great question in the chat about whether it's seeds spilled during planting versus seeds planted in the ground. And hard to say. It's difficult to measure using data that's available. But that's a great question.
Great. Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead, Al.
and so yes, it's certainly the insecticides shown to be much more important than herbicides when it comes to the effects on butterflies. Um, uh, you know, this particular study, I did not find significant effects of climate change and land cover change. And that's not because those things do not matter, but rather because of the period of the study. And during this time, that they were looking at, there was not too much variability in land cover, and, it was a short period. But so what this study found was that insecticides were more important than herbicides. And not as much effect of the other two factors, but there are studies showing that those factors matter as well.
Great. Looks like there's a comment from Carl in the chat, but I think it's just a comment. If it's not, Carl, please let us know if there's an actual question there. But talking about the declines and much less patchiness across the landscape in the Midwest, larger fields, less field borders, less kinds of crops grown, less pasture forages, better weed control, livestock absent, etc. And he's got a question about having been around and worked on farms, spilled seed is common, and that should be maybe a point of education. Would you agree there? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. The more we can minimize waste, it's something that reduces costs for farmers and would have environmental benefits. So it's one of those win-win types of solutions that should certainly be promoted.
Yeah. And I know here in Minnesota where there's a group that I'm a part of that talks a lot about trying to make sure that the wildlife plantings that farmers are doing that they're paid for aren't neonicotinoid treated seed, um, and trying to even get some laws passed around that. So that seems important as well.
Mhm.
Any
Yeah,
other?
I think sorry, just, I think crop diversification and um, is considered to be a good way to avoid pests and weeds and so on. So, but it does require long-term commitment, and but anecdotal evidence at least suggests that farmers who do that find that it is effective.
Yeah, Cardi,
Yeah, I
jump
wanted
in.
to say something too about the spilled seed comment that's in there, about the point of education. Could not agree more. That is usually guidance that is put on the bag, is that any spilled seed must go back and be collected or must be buried and drilled into the ground. However, that is not something that usually happens. There's been some great observational studies done in Minnesota where they actually stood back on an adjacent roadway and looked at planting fields and found that particularly on turns and reloading sites, there was large amounts of seed spill that were not gone back and dealt with in any kind of a timely manner. So I completely agree with you. It's quite literally money left on the ground, because that is not anything that's going to help those growers and is in violation of the pesticide label itself. So definitely something we need to talk about more.
Mhm. Yeah, great point, Hardy.
Yeah. Any other questions or anything else that Hardy or Dr. Khanna you want to share?
No, I think, just both of these studies, there's not a lot of studies like this, and both of these studies, are um, kind of, were significant in the fact that because of the data that they used and really conclusive evidence that they provided, and they were well done studies. One of them, of course, mine, so kind of a bit of that, but still, we were really surprised at how strong the results and robust the results were.
Yeah, nice. Excellent. Well,
Carl, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, thanks.
Mhm.
I remember years ago you could get for the rodenticides were mentioned, and I remember you could buy, I think it was arsenic treated millet or something for pocket gophers. Uh, what's the status of uh, I think some of that was banned. It was, and that was spilled all over the place too, and birds could just eat that and die. I mean, I'm wondering where we are with rodenticides and regulations.
Sure, I can start. The rodenticide treated millet used to be very common. It is less common now. It's not completely out of use, I wouldn't say, but it is just frankly less in vogue because of all of the accidental secondary toxicity that would happen, as well as all of the unintended consequences. So animals that weren't pocket gophers that were coming around. Baits and bait stations are still very common, particularly ones that can be sprayed out of, or deployed out of a helicopter, drone, or airplane on some really large wheat growing and grain growing operations. So it does still happen. And I would say that the biggest changes around rodenticide regulations are that there's more of a crackdown on the homeowner uses of it. So we're seeing stricter regulations both from the federal government and in a lot of cases from state governments on, what you can buy off of Amazon.com, what you can get from your local big box hardware store or other websites. However, there are usually exemptions built in for agricultural producers, and there's very little enforcement around it. A good example right now is that spotted owls in the West Coast, particularly around Southern Oregon and Northern California, one of the biggest things that's threatening to them is the use of rodenticides on marijuana farms. So we are seeing a lot of secondary exposure to raptors in those cases. So the treated grains aren't as common, but the different types of baits very much are. On the other hand, there's a lot of new products that have come to the market as well. There are some that are sodium based. There are some that are sodium nitrate or nitrite based, which primarily work by dehydrating the victims rather than causing any kind of blood loss or direct poisoning. And those don't have any secondary impact. So, it's not good for whatever eats it, but whatever eats the thing that ate it is not going to be impacted. And yeah, we could do a whole series just on rodenticides at some point too.
Thanks for sharing all of your knowledge. If there's any other questions, throw them in the chat. In the meantime, I want to thank everyone for attending the Role of Birds on the Midwest Farms webinar series as part of a professional development grant from North Central region of SARE. So thank you, SARE, for making this possible. If you are looking for some CE credits, and we would love your feedback, so please feel free to fill out the evaluation form and give us that information. And there are additional links to the resources and research papers related to this webinar that you can find on the resource page for this webinar, where we will also post the recording. So if you want to share that with others, you can feel free to do that. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.